We were supposed to have Dr. Lee Cheek giving a presentation on Southern constitutionalism and John C. Calhoun. Well, of course, he's ill, so you have to deal with me. Now, I didn't prepare anything for this, so this is going to be me riffing on some things that I think are interesting to talk about with Southern constitutionalism. I am going to mention Calhoun, I'll talk about him, and a speech that he gave in 1837. And so I want to build off of some of the things that have been said in some of the other presentations, particularly the earlier presentation today with David Brannon. I thought it was a great talk. One thing that he brought up, of course, was this interest in monarchy. Now, we have to understand, if you go back and you look at the origins of American constitutionalism, there was something called the Dominion theory. The colonists were irritated with the Parliament. They believed that they were there under the dominion of the king. And so this is why they appealed directly to the king for redress. And of course, when George III said no, that's when the break fundamentally occurred between the colonists and the crown at that point. But if you look at the Declaration, it is an indictment of the king, and it is modeled essentially after the English Bill of Rights of 1688. And I want to build off of that because Southern constitutionalism is not really Southern constitutionalism. It's American constitutionalism. In fact, what you can say about the South is that they held on to the American principles of government longer than anyone else. And so when we talk about the South and the Constitution, we talk about the Constitution in general, we're really talking about the Southern constitutional tradition. If we look at originalism, that is the Southern view of the Constitution. But for a long time, it was the American view. In fact, the Constitution would not have been ratified if we did not have that American view of the Constitution. So it became ascendant at Philadelphia. So I want to go back to the colonial period, 1754. We have discussion of union. We have the brewing war on the frontier. We've got the French and Indian War, and you have Benjamin Franklin propose a union. And of course, maybe you've seen the political cartoon with the snake, join or die. And his response to that was, well, nobody really wants to do it because the colonists are too provincial, meaning that they are too concerned about their own colony compared to the rest. And that's because even then, in the 18th century, and of course going back before that, all of these colonies believed that they were essentially self-contained entities, political entities. And I know a lot of us got involved with the Institute or other things because of politics. So we like to think about these decentralist terms. But this idea of what became states being self-contained legislative entities goes back before we get to the Constitution. You hear a lot of people talk about the compact theory of the Constitution. It's no theory. It's a fact. It's a fact. It's the compact fact. And so we have to think about language. You concede the entire field if you say, well, it's just a theory. It makes it an ideology. It's not an ideology. It's based on concrete things. So when David was talking today about Drew Gilpin Faust, she made a lot of noise years ago for a book entitled The Creation of Confederate Nationalism. And essentially she said the South was, that idea of nationalism was created in that period of time. They were trying to wrestle with this idea of what it meant to be Southern, what it meant to be Confederate. And of course they were looking at different things. Was it race? Was it slavery? Well, the South had always been a unionist area. And she's thinking in terms of government in a way. If you look at what Lincoln said a lot of the times during the war, he talked about union, but what he wanted to do was preserve his government. His government. It wasn't about the Union. The South had always been interested in the Union. In fact, they were the most unionist people from the 1750s through the 1860s. And even beyond. If you go after the war, Southerners were begging at times to be brought back into the Union to show that they really love the Union. We'll go fight for you in Cuba. We'll go fight for you in Europe. We want to be part of the Union. We love the Union. Lee loved the Union. But of course, when the Union was broken, that's when they had to think about something else. So Faust was not necessarily incorrect. They were trying to create this nationalism. In a way, she's saying that Southerners were always different. They always had this different view of government and of union. And so this idea of nationalism confronting federalism. And I know Kerry talks a lot about federalism. This is an important thing to discuss. Federalism is the core of American constitutionalism. You can't have it without it. It is the glue that held everything together. It's what everyone wanted. It's what everyone talked about. Again, the Constitution would not have been ratified without it. There is no doubt about that. The evidence is clear. You can go back into the ratification debates. You can go back to Philadelphia. John Rutledge standing up when his co-South Carolinian proposed a negative on state law. And Rutledge says that alone ought to damn the Constitution. We shouldn't have it. If we're going to have a negative of state law, we shouldn't have this thing. So that's pretty powerful when you think about that idea of these states going back to 1754, two provincial, interested in governing their own affairs. Now, Southerners were interested in a union for particular things, and that goes back to the Dominion theory. Well, we don't mind if the Crown regulates our international commerce. We don't mind if the Crown defends us. But other than that, they need to leave us alone. Kind of moving that forward into the modern era, you think about just the recent Dobbs decision. This is all that happened there. When Roe v. Wade is overturned, well, it just goes back to the states. It's a federal response. It's what should have been from the beginning. So I love, by the way, Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in that, because he brings up the problem of incorporation through the 14th Amendment. But that's a whole other issue. But again, it's responding to this idea of a federal republic. Now, again, we don't need to confuse union with government. And this government's a creation of the Republican Party. That's a monstrosity. It's always distorted this idea of government and union. Right? And New England called themselves nationalists, but they weren't really nationalists. They were always sectionalists. New Englanders figured out they can use the means of the government, the reins of government, to get what they want. And that's what Dr. DiLorenzo talked about in both of his presentations. This is Hamilton. This is Daniel Webster. This is the idea that the government can be used structurally to enforce a New England worldview. Whereas on the other side, Southerners, even John Taylor of Carolina, who's often considered to be kind of a Southern sectionalist, he never was. He, in fact, worried that the government would be in the hands of one section or another, including the South. He didn't think that should happen. The South should not dominate the government. The North should not dominate the government. It should be a union. This is exactly what Calhoun talked about when he said we have a union that benefits all and burdens all equally. That's a real union, and that's the structure of American government. Now, this again is organic. It's not ideological. It's not a proposition nation myth. It wasn't some ideology. And I point back to one of the more important speeches in American history in 1775 when Patrick Henry went to St. John's Church in Richmond. And he gave his what's often called the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, but it's really the illusion of hope. And there's one line in that shows you what this war and what the government, the structure of the American colonies and states was all about. And it's this line: I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging of the future but by the past. That's not lofty egalitarianism, some ideology driving this revolution. No. He's saying, look, what do we have in our past? We have the Magna Carta of 1215. We have the English Bill of Rights of 1688. And what do we know from all of English history? Well, we're going to get a centralized entity that's going to try to take too much from us, and we have to fight and get back what is naturally ours. That is the rights of Englishmen. He talked about the ancient constitutions. This is the core of the American War for Independence. It was a recognition of tangible, real things, not abstractions. New Englanders like to deal in abstractions. Southerners like to deal in tangible things. Now, even though in the 18th century, New Englanders were also thinking about real things as well in the little wards in New England, they wanted to preserve those things as well. But later on, with Lincoln and the Lincolnian myth, that started to become ideology. Right? We're fighting for the proposition nation, that all men are created equal. And that is, as Gary Wills said, where Lincoln revolutionized the revolution. Nobody thought of it that way until Lincoln started doing that on a large scale. Now, of course, when you think about Calhoun, and I'm going to read part of a speech that he gave in 1837. I'm going to read two parts of the speech. Calhoun is often regarded as a sectionalist. Again, he never was. To the day he died in 1850, he was always interested in union. Union. It was his primary objective. He wanted to save the Union. He wasn't a sectionalist. Calhoun was a unionist. And he believed that the Union should, again, benefit all and burden all equally. And he was willing to even go to bat for northern states. So this speech is from 1837, and it's on the admission of Michigan as a state into the Union. Now, I was talking to Dr. Wilson ahead of time, and he said he used this speech at a couple of Liberty Fund conferences, and everyone would ask, why are you handing out this speech of Michigan? Who cares about Michigan? Well, that's a good question. Who does care about Michigan? But in this case, it's because it shows these principles are universal when it comes to American government. It wasn't just in the South. He wasn't just worried about South Carolina. He wasn't just worried about Georgia or Virginia or North Carolina. Calhoun was worried about the structure of the government. And he says it in this speech, and more importantly, the structure of the Union, right? Because that was the key. What happened is very interesting. Michigan was going to be admitted as a state. The Congress decided they didn't like the border. So they rejected the original admission, and then they told Michigan it had to create a new convention to have a new constitution with a new border. And Calhoun said, you can't do that. You can't tell a state that you have to hold a convention. That convention's no longer valid. The Congress has no power here. The only entity that can create a state are the people of the state. This goes back, of course, to another timeless American principle, the consent of the governed. In this case, it's the consent of the people of Michigan to create a state. And of course, there's another theory that floats around out there that, well, only the original 13 states are equal. All the other states, they came in later, the general government created them, and they don't have the same status as the original 13 states. So maybe we could talk about the original 13 states having some right to secession or independence, but not a state like Mississippi, because it came later, or Michigan or Indiana. Those were created. Well, Calhoun addresses that. No. The general government didn't create those states. The people created those states when they formed the state. So he says it in the speech. This is why this speech is so good, because he gets to these very important, what might say Southern principles, but again, these are American principles of union. So I'm going to read this. He says, quote, ours is a federal republic, a union of states. That term is essential. Again, if we could hone in on the language. A lot of times you hear people say we have a republic. We don't have a republic. We have a federal republic. We don't have a singular republic. That's France. We don't want to be France. That's a unitary state. And when you say we have a republic, you're saying we have a unitary state, a united state. We're a federal republic of states, a union of states. He says Michigan is a state in the course of admission and differing only from the other states in her federal relations. She is declared to be a state in the most solemn manner by your own act. And of course, he's talking to Congress. And the great thing about this speech, too, is he's giving it back to the imbeciles in Congress, because there are already a lot of stupid people there that couldn't get this, right? She can come into the Union only as a state, and by her voluntary assent given by the people of the state in convention called by the constituted authority of the state. To admit the state of Michigan on the authority of a self-created meeting, or one called by the direct authority of Congress, passing by the authorities of that state, would be the most monstrous proceeding under our Constitution that can be conceived, the most repugnant to its principles, and dangerous in its consequences. Can you not? He's saying, look, this destroys everything. If Congress can say you're no longer a state, you said you're a state, but now you're not a state, that's dangerous. That's repugnant to the principles of the Union. Now, where do we know that Congress did this? And where did Congress say that they can declare a state not a state? Yeah, in Reconstruction, right? They did it. During military Reconstruction, okay, Lincoln said you're going to come back in the Union of States, and Congress said no. You're now a military district. You're no longer a state. And of course, the Supreme Court in 1869 codified this supposedly with Texas v. White. The Congress can do that anytime they want. They can declare a state not a state, and then they can declare it is a state, and then maybe it's not a state again. Calhoun is in 1837 saying this is repugnant to American principles of government. And he's not talking about Southern principles of government. This is American principles of government. It would establish a direct relation between the individual citizens of a state and the general government, an utter subversion of the federal character of our system. So you've bypassed the states, and now it's a direct relationship between the center and the citizens. The states are gone. In other words, they've just abolished the entire system by doing this. Now remember, this is 1837. This isn't 1859. Of course, he died in 1850. It's not some Southerner standing up in 1861 saying this is what we need to do, and they're creating some new theory of government. No, this is 1837 when he's saying this. An issue that had nothing to do with slavery, had nothing to do with tariffs. It was a border dispute, essentially. That's why this speech is also so good. The relation of the citizens to this government is through the states exclusively. They are subject to its authority and laws only because the state has assented they should be. If she dissents, their assent is nothing. So if the state says, you know what, I'm not going to let you do anything to our citizens, doesn't matter what the citizens say, the state has said, we just blocked this, we provided a hedge. This is, again, Calhoun using the states as they were intended. If you go back to the ratification debates, you can even find Northerners that said, that question was asked, what happens if the federal government becomes too powerful and it usurps power from the states? Well, someone like Roger Sherman would say, well, the states would be powerful enough to check it. They could just stop it. The states can do that. Oliver Ellsworth said they'll just withhold their senators. So just take their senators, call them home. If enough states do that, then they can't do any business. The government is abolished, essentially. It doesn't do anything. It is through the state, then, and through the state alone that the United States government can have any connection with the people of a state. And does not then the senator from Pennsylvania see that if Congress can authorize a convention of the people in the state of Michigan without the authority of the state, it matters not what is the object, it may, in like manner, authorize conventions in any other state for whatever purpose it may think proper. So the Congress could just say, all right, well, if we can do it here, why can't we call a convention in South Carolina to do something we want it to do? The general government calling convention, well, where's that power? It's not in the Constitution. That would be when Tom Lee Renz often says, Jefferson looked and found only blank space between the lines. That's where they're finding it. It's in there somewhere. We can find it between the lines. We can do this somewhere. So then he says, Michigan is as much a sovereign state as any other, differing only, as I have said, to her federal relations. If we give our sanction to the assemblage of December on the principle laid down by the senator from Pennsylvania, then we establish the doctrine that Congress has power to call at pleasure conventions within the states. Is there a senator on this floor who will assent to such a doctrine? Is there one especially who represents the smaller states of this union or the weaker section? Admit the power and every vestige of states' rights would be destroyed. Our system would be subverted. And instead of a confederacy of free and sovereign states, we should have all power concentrated here, and this would become the most odious despotism. It's beautiful. That's just a beautiful line, because he's predicting 20 years in the future, 25 years in the future is what we're going to get. He knows it's going to happen. By this act, not some tariff, again, not some legislation on slavery extension of the territories, by an act of admission of a state. He indeed must be blind who does not see that such a power would give the federal government a complete control of all the states. I call upon senators now to arrest a doctrine so dangerous. Let it be remembered that under our system, bad precedents live forever, good ones only perish. Is that not true? Well, we've passed the bill. let's say we're going to get Obamacare, and we're going to repeal that, John McCain. We're going to take it out in the courts. It's still there, right? 1940s, you get 1930s, you get all the New Deal, and we're going to repeal that. Well, it's still there. So once it's there, it's there. You're not getting rid of it. It'll never go away, and Calhoun is saying that. That is, again, this is not Southern constitutionalism, this is American constitutionalism. This was recognized as the original principles of the Federal Republic. He says, we may not feel all the evil consequences at once, but this precedent, once set, will surely be received and will become the instrument of infinite evil. So then that was the conclusion of his first day. He spoke on this issue for 2 days. And the conclusion of his second day speech is something I alluded to last night when I was talking about Calhoun and what he said about it, what it meant to be a conservative. And I want to read this little part too, because this gets back to this idea of tangible things and what the states are and what they mean to the entire federal system. That again is Southern constitutionalism. He says, looking then to the approaching struggle, I take my stand immovably. I am a conservative in its broadest and fullest sense, and such I shall ever remain, unless indeed the government shall become so corrupt and disordered that nothing short of revolution can reform it. Now, we talked about this same kind of principle a little earlier today. What happens when the government is so corrupt? What do? Well, you might need a revolution. If it's so bad, what are you going to do? We have to remember that the founding generation through this generation, these are men of action. Now we just like to talk about things and maybe we'll vote better. What are you going to do about it? Well, I'll vote for that guy. He's going to make it better. He says, I solemnly believe that our political system is, in its purity, not only the best that ever was formed, but the best possible that can be devised for us. It is the only one by which free states, so populous and wealthy and occupying so vast an extent of territory, can preserve their liberty. Now, notice who he said preserves liberty here. Not the central government, but the states. Right? The states preserve liberty. Again, that's the entire conception of federalism and Southern constitutionalism, the American model of government. The states preserve liberty. One of the arguments, of course, against the Bill of Rights was that it was unnecessary. It's unnecessary because every state constitution already had a Bill of Rights. What do you need another one for? That's going to make people assume that the central government can do all these things we swore up and down they couldn't do. You see, we also have to change the language of that too. There's no anti-federalist tradition. People say the Confederate Constitution is part of the anti-federalist tradition. It's really the Federalist tradition, the real Federalists, not the anti-federalists. The real Federalists, they wanted a real federal republic. And when you look at the Confederate Constitution, they fixed the problems of the original. That's all they did. They thought these structural problems were there, we fixed those. It's not anti-federalist, it's federalist. And the proponents of the document were not federalists, they were nationalists. They wanted to nationalize and centralize power. That was the argument that they were being confronted with, and they swore up and down that's not the case. He says, thus thinking I cannot hope for a better. Having no hope for a better, I am a conservative. And because I am a conservative, I am a states' rights man. That's one of the best lines Calhoun ever gave. Because I am a conservative, I am a states' rights man. Well, why would he be a states' rights man? Because the states protected the culture, traditions, and people of those communities. They reflected the political culture of the people in the states. This is why the states are important now. When people woke up in California after the Dobbs decision rioting. I couldn't understand why. Nothing changed in California. Everything stayed the same. They saw all the same little things they could do there they could do before, but in some states, of course, things changed, and the people in those states applauded. California could be California again. Let's just keep it in California. And of course, Alabama and South Carolina and Mississippi and Texas, they could be those states again. I believe that in the rights of the states are to be found the only effectual means of checking the overaction of this government, to resist its tendency to concentrate all power here, and to prevent a departure from the Constitution. A departure from the Constitution. Sometimes I'm asked, when did the Constitution die? My answer is 1789. Right then. It died in 1789 with the passage of the First Judiciary Act, because Section 25 allowed for state laws to be appealed to federal courts. And Virginia tried to stop this. Of course, as I said before, only the best people are born in Virginia. So Virginia tried to stop this. And in the Cohens v. Virginia case of 1821, John Marshall said, you can't do that. What they did, what Virginia said is, okay, look, only certain decisions can be appealed to federal courts. All these others, no, you can't touch it. So the Cohens brothers were selling illegal lottery tickets in Virginia. They're from Maryland. They're selling D.C. lottery tickets in Virginia. And they're arrested and fined and convicted and said, go home. Well, they sued because, and Virginia said, nah, you can't sue us. You're done. You can't sue in federal court. Well, the Supreme Court took the case anyways, and they ruled against Virginia. And from that point forward, again, this is 1821, there really wasn't a way for the states to stop this stuff, at least unless you went to the channels of nullification or secession. You couldn't appeal to the court anymore to try to do anything. The states were trying. Virginia was saying, we got to stop this. Again, that's the American constitutional tradition. But when you nationalize power, and of course Marshall being from Virginia, that's problematic, but when you centralize and nationalize power, this is what you get. He says, state interposition, or to express it more fully, the right of a state to interpose her sovereign voice as one of the parties to our constitutional compact against the encroachments of this government, is the only means of sufficient potency to effect all this. And I am therefore its advocate. I am therefore its advocate. State interposition, 1837. Now, of course, he had already dealt with this during the nullification crisis. He'd already given his exposition. And a lot of people like to read those documents, speeches from Calhoun on the Force Bill and others, but this one is just better because he really hammers this home. He says, I rejoice to hear the senators from North Carolina and Pennsylvania do us the justice to distinguish between nullification and the anarchical and revolutionary movements in Maryland and Pennsylvania. I know they did not intend it as a compliment, but I regard it as the highest. So he had Pennsylvania, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania, standing up and saying, well, what you're saying is anarchy. We had this in Pennsylvania. Calvin was saying, no, that's not the same. And and I regard it as a compliment to say that I believe in nullification. That's a good thing. They are right. Day and night are not more different and more unlike in everything. They are unlike in their principles, their objects, and their consequences. He says, as a conservative and a states' rights man, or if you will, have it a nullifier, I have and shall resist all encroachments on the Constitution, whether it be the encroachment of this government on the states or the opposite, the executive on Congress or Congress on the executive. My creed is to hold both governments and all the departments of each to their proper sphere. Now, this is not often discussed with nullification, but Calhoun looked at this as always a check on every part of the system. It wasn't just the states and the general government. You could use it to check the power of Congress from the executive or the executive from the Congress or whatever the case may be. And he always blamed Congress for all the problems. Congress is it. I mean, it's not the Supreme Court. It's not the executive. The Congress keeps making all this mess because they keep punting responsibility and the president takes it over and Congress does nothing. So then what are we going to do? Well, we got to have the states, the fourth leg of the stool of government, which is, again, the entire system as it was designed. So when you think about American constitutionalism and then moving forward again into the 1860s and you think about Southerners who drafted the Confederate Constitution, you look at the structure there and it's often said, well, if these Southerners really believed in secession, why did they put a clause in the Confederate Constitution that allowed a state to secede? Well, they wouldn't do that because that's always a reserved power of the states. You don't have to say it, it's already there. So if you put it in there, you would recognize that this was always something that was never really granted to the states. And where do we know this is something that the founding generation thought was possible? Well, we can go to a Pennsylvanian, James Wilson, who in October of 1787 goes out in front of the Philadelphia State House, or Pennsylvania State House, which is Independence Hall today. And he makes a speech, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he says, you know what? Everyone's worried about this Constitution. It's going to centralize power. Now, James Wilson was called James de Caledonia. He liked to wear his glasses like I do and look down at people and haughty. And this is a guy that was nearly killed at one point. There was a Fort Wilson, they called it. His home was attacked during the War for Independence because he wasn't sufficiently patriotic enough. So they attacked him. And now he's this leading figure, became a Supreme Court justice. But Caledonia goes in front of the Pennsylvania State House and says, you know what, you don't have to worry about this. If the Constitution doesn't say the general government can do it, it can't do it. Whereas the exact opposite is the case with the states. If it doesn't say they can't do it, they can do anything they want. So, does the Constitution say a state can't secede? No. Does the Constitution say a state can't nullify a federal law? No, and of course you have the 10th Amendment to back that up too, but that's the point. So when you look at what Calhoun is saying here, again, that's the American constitutional tradition. It's not really the Southern Constitution. The South hung on to this longer because New Englanders figured out. Daniel Webster is a prime example of this. I love Daniel Webster. In 1812, Daniel Webster gets up and makes a speech. And he says, you know what we got to do? We got to nullify laws in favor of this embargo and all the things they're doing for this War of 1812. And if we can't do that, we should secede, essentially is what he's saying. And then just a little over, maybe close to 20 years later, you know what? States' rights is disunion. You can't do that. Why? Because he figured out, well, this tariff was pretty good for my constituents now. In 1812, it stunk. We were free traders back then. Now we're protectionists. So now this is good for us. And so nationalism is the way forward. To Calhoun's credit, he was always a nationalist, a union man. He supported a revenue-producing tariff. He thought that was a good idea. These are things that we needed. In fact, at one point said, maybe we need internal improvements. Well, it can help the West. Maybe we should do that, help our fellow farmers out West. But he was always interested in a real union, as were Southerners all the way up to the day that secession took place in 1860 and 61. That was their complaint. You've broken the compact. You violated the Constitution. What else can we do? And of course, New Englanders tried to do the exact same thing during the War of 1812. They talked about seceding in 1794. 1794, 5 years after the Constitution is ratified, you've got Oliver Ellsworth and Rufus King pulling aside John Taylor and saying, hey, John, this thing's broken. What do you think about New England seceding? I wish John Taylor would have said, get out. But he didn't. He wrote to Jefferson and said, this is crazy. What are these people talking about? It's only 5 years. What are we doing here? Well, I mean, if he had been prophetic enough to see, he should have just told him to leave. Here's your coat. Please leave. That would have been good. But he didn't. And of course, in 1800, there's 1798, of course, there's some discussion of it. 1800, when Jefferson is elected. 1801, you've got New Englanders saying, we got to get out of this union again. I wish they just would have said, taken it up and just gone, right? We would have been a lot happier. And then, of course, the War of 1812. All of this shows that this idea that the states could do these things was baked into the system from the beginning, and Southerners just believed. They believed New Englanders. They believed all this. And when New Englanders violated the compact, they thought they had no choice. So when people ask you some questions, tell them that it's the Union that's important, not the Southerners were Unionists. They were always Federalists, believing in a federal republic. This is why there wasn't really a Confederate nationalism, because they were always Unionists, first and foremost. And each one of these states, of course, had its own political culture and differences. And Virginians recognized that South Carolina was different, and South Carolina recognized that Georgia was different, and they all thought Georgia was crazy. Still are. But they all recognize these differences. And the other thing is, of course, there is no anti-federalist tradition. It's a federalist tradition in the South, and we have to get these terms correct. If we don't, we concede there's no compact theory, there's a compact fact. If we don't get the terms correct, we lose the ball game. Thank you for your time.